That was the wrong button, wasn't it? Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening, and good morning even. Did this work? Did this work? I didn't hear anything at my end, but hey, that's one of those things. I'm so glad that you could all join me from wherever you are and from whenever you are, especially Steve, who is really up early this morning. And I do apologize for the hair. I think I do need a little trim. I'm looking at myself here at the, just needs a little bit of a trim there. I have an interesting little thing prepared for you today. I was not actually prepared anything. I just thought this is a good opportunity to drop by and show you the ropes of the Blender. Blender's been, thank you so much, Mac9 for subscribing. That's very nice. So Blender 2.8 has been released this week, which is great. Officially, we've had a look at it for several weeks already, and it's got the new interface and everything, and it's just, it's many of you will probably say, hey, like Patrick, for example, I know how to delete the cube, and that's how far I go, and I don't blame you, because Blender is a difficult, complex machine, but it's also a lot of fun to work with that. Thank you so much for hosting my stream, Julia. I appreciate that. Very cool. And it's trying to dodge the guy. So, no, I understand, Patrick, but it's one of those things that I'm thinking there's a lot of folks out there who would like to use Blender and who just don't really know where to get started. And I thought that's a great opportunity to give you a little primer on Blender today. And the way we're going to do that is, the idea was to launch the Blender 2.8 release version, this one here, and talk you through how to actually get a picture out of it. So from basically, rather than deleting the cube, leaving the cube in and fiddling with the lights and showing you where you can actually press the button to set up your camera and to get a picture out. Maybe that's a very cool idea. There we go. Thank you for hosting my stream, Rod, and thank you so much for dropping by, Komodo. This is good. We've got a full house today. So there we go. Let's get going with Blender. Who here has experience with Blender? Who's like a power user, like Christina, for example? You're a power user. I know that. And thank you for following as well, Komodo. Very exciting. See, Rod has zero experience, but this is why we're here for. This is cool. Have you got the latest version of Blender 2.8? Because that is vital. Blender has changed interfaces from 2.79 to 2.8. Drastic changes have happened, and this is what the thing looks like now. So that is why we're here. Newbie Extreme. This is exactly how we can help you. So first of all, I think I'm going to go get rid of that gray bar at the top here, because I like to work on the complete full screen thing. And I do that on the window tab up here. And I toggle the window full screen. That's one thing I like doing. Well, that's a total personal preference. You don't have to do that. Right now, I've not actually touched anything in the Blender interface. So I thought perhaps a good way to get started here is to, don't feel dumb, Patrick, don't feel dumb, never feel dumb. There we go. Learned already something new, that's cool. So the first thing we're going to do is see how we can navigate the scene. That is intuitive if you know how to do it, but if you don't know how to do it, then it's terrible. So what you can do is, with a regular mouse and the middle mouse button, very important, you can click that middle mouse button down, so like the scrolly wheel, click that down, hold it clicked, and then move around with the mouse. Left to right. What was that? I don't know what hotkey is, Julia. Could you read it out? I don't find it. I don't know what hotkey is. I'm so sorry. The screencast keys, yes, I've tried that. It doesn't work for me, I'm afraid. Maybe you can talk me through it. Yes, so screencast keys, just for those of you who don't know that, it's a little program that lets you see what keys I'm pressing. I've tried to install it. It doesn't work. I can go there and we can have a look through it together. There we go. Screencast keys. It is enabled. Well, now it is enabled, and I'm not entirely sure what I need to put here, region, area, or window. None of these seem to bring anything up. So I thought I'm going to do it without it and just go talk you through it. Because, no matter what I press, screencast keys just don't seem to come up. So I don't know. So anyway, I'm gonna leave them on. I haven't really got any experience there, and oh, there you go. And then what I do? I mean, shouldn't they be on now? Oh, I need to enable them here. Ah, you say middle mouse. Now we need to. Thank you so much, Steve. That's very kind of you. Very nice. See, that is you teaching me stuff. There we go. And then we also want to do last operator, right? Is that cool? Do we want to do last operator? And then area offset, maybe. That's kind of cool here. That's actually where the chat is, isn't it? We don't want it there. Maybe we'll put it somewhere. Put it somewhere else. Like here. And then it disappears. Oh, there we go. Now it's back. I don't know if I'm a friend of the screencast keys here. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be something. There, how's that? And we're going to leave that maybe 5 seconds. Good? Happy? Let's do this. Right, screencast keys. Anyway, I was talking about moving the interface. And so at the bottom, I guess you can see now what keys I'm pressing. Should I press any keys? So interface navigation. Left little, click down that little wheel on your mouse, click it, hold it down, and then move it around. So that's kind of cool. That's number one. I like doing that. That's number one. Number two, to zoom in and out, you scroll that wheel forward and back. That's how you do that. Then to move the screen left or right, you go and hit Shift while, and this depends on your preference now, Shift while middle mouse clicking, and then dragging that left or right or top and bottom. I guess the second operator is a little bit cut off here, so, you know, there, forget last operator. There, is that cool? Yeah, awesome, groovy. Yes, so that is navigation. That's important. Navigation is important. And then, of course, you should be able to, if you're familiar with other 3D applications, you're probably looking for the thing that lets you frame up a camera. And that is currently not something that's to me, that wasn't very obvious when I got started with Blender. And I'm by no means a power user at all. So that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm going to tell you today. So you see some of the items in our scene are already here. So the scene usually comes up with a little cube icon here. That's that. It comes up with one light. That's this thing here. And then it also comes in with a camera, which is this guy here. And by left clicking, usually we can select the object that we want to deal with and then move perhaps. But Blender traditionally has used the right mouse button to select things, and that confused a lot of users. I suppose you can still choose, and I don't know if there is a preference, to be honest. I don't know if that is something that is now built into Blender. I just thought I'm going to show you where you can turn your preference into left click or right click in case yours is set to right click and you left click on something and nothing happens. It is, I believe, in interface up here. And somewhere here, I don't know, somewhere here, I forgot where that was. Was it input? Input, that's where that was. There we go, input. No, it's also not input. What a shame. I thought it was big. Somewhere, it is somewhere here. I forgot where. Christina can tell you. Editing, themes, I have no idea. Somewhere here you can check, you can switch from left clicking to right clicking. I've set it up for left clicking, and I hope we're going to figure out how you can switch it to your preference. So I like the left clicking. So now that we can navigate around the scene, let's have a look how we can frame up what we're looking at through the camera, because right now it looks like we're in something called the user perspective, like as seen on here. And that is something that Carrara would call it the director's point of view, or that studio would call it the perspective view. And that is kind of the running around camera. You don't really get to render this view that you're looking at. You can see a rendered version of it, but it's not something that you can take a picture of, if you know what I mean. For that, you have to look through a camera like this one, and then you can render what comes out of the camera. And to look through the camera, you can press the 0 key on the numpad. So that's not the 0 key on top of your keyboard. That's the one at the like bottom right on your kind of 10 block on the right hand side of your keyboard, if your keyboard has such a thing. Is it our key mapping preferences? Thank you so much. So let's just see if we can drop that here. This is the left clicking thing. Key mapping and then preferences. There we go. Very good. Thank you so much, Christina. Of course. Thank you. Very good. And hey, by the way, congratulations for the 8 steps. That is really, really cool. I love that. Very good. And don't worry about the other 2. I mean, you know, that you're gonna be jumping up and down stairs very soon again, I'm sure. But the 8 steps, 8 stair steps, that is very cool. Very, very cool. I'm proud of you. So here it is. This is left clicking or right clicking. So right clicking means you would select objects in the viewport with the right mouse button. That was kind of the Blender default, but we don't want to use that. We want to use the left click. There we go. There. So the 0 key on the numpad will toggle between that director's view or the user perspective and that camera that you want to look through. But watch what happens if you say, yeah, that's not really the framing I would like to see. I'd like to see the cube from a different perspective. If you now try and do what we just did with holding the left mouse button down and move the scene around, then this happens. And you go, yeah, well, now I'm no longer looking through the camera. I'm kind of looking at the cube from a different perspective, but it looks like my camera has also moved over here. So now I'm not actually changing what I'm seeing through the camera. And in fact, if I press the numpad 0 again, I'm back at where I started. So what's going on there? Well, that's something we can change in one of those menus on the right hand side that we need to bring up and just click a couple of things, and then we can frame up the camera. So N on your keyboard brings up this little fly out panel here. I'm not entirely sure what that's called. I'm sure it has a name, but this has several tabs here. So this and that I've added. So you'll have item, tool, and view. And then depending on which one of these things is clicked, it'll show something different. So when I press N, that thing goes away. When I press N again, that thing comes back. So my thing that I'm interested in is under the view tab here, little view tab. And it has so many things open here. I'm going to close a few down just so that we get a little bit. Tool panel, excellent. That's the one. Tool panel. I'm going to close these things down so I've got a slightly shorter list. You can close things down by list here. Clicking that little disclosure triangle here makes it a little bit shorter. Sometimes Blender comes up with something that is a lot, there's just so much open that you think, oh, my eyes hurt, my brain hurts, I don't know where to look now. And what we want to look at is this little box here that says lock camera to view. That's under view lock. And if you click that, then you'll see that there's a red box around my thing, the thing that I'm framing up now, a little red dotted line. So if I switch that off, red line is gone. If I switch that on, red line is there. And that means that now when I move my viewport, the camera will actually follow that. So if I do that, look at that, this is what it's now following. And now I can set this up, which is exactly what I want. And I can zoom in and out, and once again with the shift and the middle mouse button, I can do this and move that scene and so forth. So that's how I can do that. And then if I want to go run around in my viewport again and position my objects, then you just untick this little thing, and then automatically you'll just move around the viewport again without that affecting the camera. But if you ever wanted to affect the camera, you just press 0. Then make sure you click this thing, lock camera to view, and then you frame up your scene, which is great. So I'm going to do something else before I frame up my scene, because we haven't spoken about the aspect ratio, how to make this 16:9, how to make that portrait and all that. We're going to come to that maybe. I'm going to switch this off again here, the little tick box, the lock camera to view. And I'm going to go and put a few more objects perhaps in my scene. Actually, I'm not going to, not a few, I'm just going to go and make sure that my cube is positioned correctly. And I'm just going to add a floor here so that we can see what this is going to look like with lighting. So right now, you'll notice maybe that these lines here, they seem to go into the center of the cube. And that's because the cube comes into the very center of the scene in a height of 2 by 2 by 2 Blender units. So that means it's sitting there dead center. So the center of the cube is at the center of the scene. That means the cube extends above the ground plane as well as below the ground plane. And if we wanted to see the full cube in our render, I would like to position something like a ground directly on where the grid is now here. And then I'll just move the cube up a little bit. And let me do that. That's something that's kind of also basic moving of mesh objects. It's fairly easy once you get used to it, but it's a big stumbling block for people who are not used to it. So they've introduced this thing here, which is the little move tool. And you can use it just like any other manipulator, a regular 3D manipulator. You just click that and then hold it and move it somewhere that you'd like to move it to. And you can kind of estimate where you want to put that object. Works with scaling and also works with moving it along 2 axes. So this little red thing that locks the cube in between the blue axis and the green axis here. So that means it won't ever come forward or go back. It'll always stay in that plane, and then you just move around it like that. But I don't really use that thing because I've learned Blender a little while ago. So Control Z twice will bring that back to where it once was. And I'll just go select this thing again. Blender is big on these shortcut keys. And there's really 3 only that are important to remember. And that is G for grab. If I click G and then I move the cube, so any selected object, I can now move that along the screen plane, so to say. So I can move that up, down, or wherever I want to move it. With escape, I'll go and let go of it so that it drops back into the same position. That's G for grab, like, grab hold of something. There's also S for scaling, and that works the same way. So press S, and then you see this little icon that comes up. Now when you move your mouse forward or back, you'll see that the cube goes smaller or larger. So that's cool. And once again, escape will get you out of that. And then the final one is, you've guessed it, R for rotate. So hit R, and then you can rotate and tumble the cube around. And that's usually what people do when you see modeling tutorials. And once again, escape gets you out of there. That's what you see when people model really quick and you go, oh my God, that looks awesome what you're doing. How are you doing it? And that's how they're doing it, with shortcuts. And so G for grab, S for scale, R for rotate. And it kind of gets better there with Blender, because you can string multiple things together. So one other thing I need to bring your attention to is this little thing here, which is this little axis icon here. The X-axis is the red one that we can see here. The Y-axis is the green one. Z-axis is the one that goes up and down. It's different to DAZ Studio and many other applications. So usually the Y-axis is the one that points up, and you have the X and Z-axis are the ones that are kind of flat on the ground. But really, those are just arbitrary labels. As long as you know which axis is which, and you can remember that by looking at that icon at the top right there, you'll be kind of in the safe waters. So why this is important is because these letters, Blender recognizes these letters. So if I wanted to move my cube exactly up or down, I can use the grab command together with an axis command. So what I mean by that is, if I wanted to move it up or down, I can press G, not touch the mouse, leave the mouse alone, then press the Y-axis, then press the Z-axis, so G, Z, and now that blue axis here is highlighted, or highlit rather, and that means the cube's now going to move in that direction. When I move my mouse up and down, then the cube is going to move in exactly that axis only and nowhere else. So rather than just pressing G and then position the cube kind of arbitrarily, by pressing G followed by Z, I lock in one axis, and that's great for moving the cube in exactly the same spot, just moving it up or down. And it gets better, so it's a very, very cool system that they've developed there. It works with one axis. It also works with two axes. So imagine I wanted to move my cube exactly in the XY plane here and not move it up or down. If I wanted it in the same height, but move it kind of on one plane, I can go G, Shift Z. And then what happens is Blender will highlight both the green and the red axis. And now I can move the cube around just on the plane. So it's kind of locked onto the plane. And that's very cool. So it doesn't move in the height, it moves now in two axes at the same time. And then just go again, once again, escape will get you out. And G just by itself doesn't lock onto any axis. So that's why I can basically do whatever with the cube now, and whatever I feel is the right spot, I can drop it there. So that's how that works. That also works with scaling. So I can make the cube kind of twice its size by going S and then pressing Z, and then it'll go and grow in one direction. That's cool. I have to move the mouse left and right for that. Or I can make it grow into both the X and Y plane by pressing S and then going Shift Z, and then the cube will grow like that. It's very exciting. And this is kind of the mentality of how you can really quickly manipulate your objects. That's very groovy. You can also add a number to that. I don't want to make it too complicated, but you can add a number to that. So right now I know that the default cube in Blender is 2 units high. So we have the kind of the grid here, and it's got 1 unit above it and 1 unit below it. If I wanted to move it exactly onto the plane, I can then go and hold down, press G again, then press Z, not touch the mouse, don't touch the mouse, and type the number 1, and then press Enter. And now you'll see that the cube is moved, but it's moved by a numeric value, which is 1 unit, 1 Blender unit. And that's a very exact movement that you can specify there. I can also go GZ20, and that'll have moved the cube like, way up there. So that is also possible. Control Z will bring that back. And once again, Control Z will bring that back right into the center. But I like it to just kind of hover on that grid. So GZ1 will move it 1 unit up, and hit Enter to lock that in. And that's how you exactly position a cube or your object. So you can do that with any object. So if I wanted to rotate the cube, which isn't going to be noticeable, but if I want to rotate the cube by 90 degrees, what would I do? Pick an axis like the Z axis, and I'd go R followed by Z, so that it locks the axis in, and then I type a number, for example 90, which we're not going to see, so because there, that's 90-degree rotation, but the cube looks the same from all sides, so how can we tell I've actually done anything? Well, let's use a different number. So GZ45. Whoops, I'm so sorry. RZ, my goodness, 45. There we go. Cube is now rotated exactly 45 degrees. That's cool. I'm going to not do that. I'm going to go Control Z to bring it exactly back to where it was. And I'm going to add an object, much like the cube, but, boring. It'll be a plane, and that'll represent our ground. Because right now, if we were to render the cube, then we wouldn't see any shadows. We need something to catch the shadow. So I'm going to go and just build myself a little ground there. And that is yet another little shortcut key. You can use the menu for that as well, but I've really forgotten where that is. So I'm using the shortcut keys, but there are menu commands for that. And that's just something I didn't even want to mention it, but I just want something to catch the shadows here. So if you don't understand adding objects, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. You'll pick that up at one point. Shift A will bring up this menu that lets me add any of these things, a curve, a surface, meta ball, anything. I'm going to add a mesh plane, just a 2-dimensional plane. That's akin to using the create a primitive menu in Dash Studio, for example. Blender doesn't even have primitives. You have to load them in and use them in Blender. So as soon as you do that, you can move the mouse, usually. Maybe you can't. I would like to press enter to just go and lock that thing in. The plane is now exactly underneath the cube and also the same size as the cube. So it looks like we haven't done anything, but we have. Up in the scene tab here, you can see that we now have a plane in addition to our cube. That's kind of the same scene hierarchy that we know from all the other 3D applications here. You can select objects from here as well, or you can select them in the scene. So now I can't really select my plane from the scene because I can't really see it. So I have to select it with the scene outliner here. So I want to make the plane larger so that we can actually see it, so that it's got, you know, some kind of ground there. So once again, I can do that with S and then just move the mouse and make it as large as I want. That's my floor. Or I can go and hit escape. That's also cool. And type in a numeric value. So I can do S followed by 10. So that'll scale the plane up by a factor of 10. Or if I wanted something even larger, I can do that. Maybe, you know, S followed by 100. There we go. Massive plane. It's like the never-ending plane. Exciting. So there we go. That is now our scene. It's not exciting, but you know, it is the rudiments of a scene, and we see no shadows. It's kind of, well, we see a little bit of an illumination there. We have something like a headlamp on our camera, something like that, but it doesn't really have any realistic shading on it yet. So that's, I guess, the next step that we can talk about. We can display this scene in different ways. So right now we're using this thing at the top here, which they call the viewport shading. And that's kind of a cheap shading, cheap in regards to it's very fast to render, even on low powered computers. And it just shows you what the objects look like. It's kind of, it's not really lit. It's kind of a basic lighting on there. But there's these two other things here. There's one next to it, which is called the, what's that called again? Is that called the look def display mode, which looks a little bit more realistic. Don't really know what that's for, I gotta tell you. But then the one on the right here, that's the actual rendered preview. So that's akin to switching on the NVIDIA iRay preview in Dash Studio. And if we click that, it might take a little bit longer. And now we do actually see a shadow. And we would see materials if we had defined them on the objects, which we're not going to talk about today. So, you know, in case you fear your brain might melt, don't worry about it. We're not going to talk about nodes or particle emitters or any such things. But we can now see that there is in fact a shadow in our scene, and that there is a light source, namely this one here, that appears to cast that shadow. And it seems to illuminate this spot, and it seems to not illuminate much else of the scene. So that's perfect. It's a good starting point. Oh, look def is Eevee too. I didn't know that. I don't actually know what the difference is between the look def and the full-blown render. I guess there's less calculations going on. Techno Magia. I'm not sure if I'm going to be that good. I just don't know. But maybe that's something for the future. Oh yes, absolutely. Mach 9, that is a very, very good point. That's more like a modeling thing. So yeah, absolutely. If you scale something up and if you modify that, definitely apply the scale. Yes, if you want to make use of that. So there is one thing that, so somebody brought up the Eevee rendering engine. So Eevee is, David, thank you so much for the super chat donation. I very much appreciate that. Mike brought up Eevee. Eevee is one of those words you may have heard when you've been listening to Blender recently. It's a new real-time rendering engine. So much like in Dash Studio and all the other applications, we have several ways of displaying what we're looking at. And the previous one here, the first one, that used to be OpenGL, and I don't really know what it is anymore, but it's a very fast one, but it's not very realistic. And if you create something that works in that displays your scene realistically, then you always end up with a long render time because the engine has to go through it and kind of make that happen. And so Eevee is a new almost real-time render engine that gives you almost real-time effects. So it's a very good step in the direction that lets you preview lights without having to click a render button and see, no, actually that doesn't look good, or you have to look at it with less samples or whatnot. So that's where Eevee comes in. Eevee is really cool, and Eevee is on by default. And as you've noticed, if I switch from this to that, Eevee just kicks into action instantly. And this is not Cycles. So Cycles, you've also heard that in connection with Blender. Cycles is also a render engine, but that's the really high quality one that takes a little while to turn your 3D scene into a picture. And that is something that we're gonna look at right now, actually. In the new version of Blender, I believe on the right here, can you see that here? Yeah, this little knob here where it says context, it's the one that has a little camera icon on here. There you see which render engine is currently being used. So it's defaulting to Eevee, literally just above me, isn't it? But if you click on that menu, and that's kind of hidden now by my face there, isn't it crazy? There we go. If you click on that, you have the Workbench engine and you have the Cycles engine. And that's usually what you do, what you choose for images you render out in highest quality. So watch what happens if we switch that to Cycles. I get like a little fuzzy preview, and it's a little grainy still, and it doesn't look as great quality-wise as my Eevee scene did. So it takes a little bit of time, is what I'm trying to say, for the scene to get rendered there. But that's just because it's a much more calculation-intense process. So you can also see that maybe some of the shadows here get a little softer and a bit more realistic, whereas with Eevee, they were a little harsh and they're a little fuzzy. So if I go and zoom in to that edge of the shadow, don't know if you can see it on the screen right here, it just kind of interpolates things so that it's fast. That's what it's for. Eevee is fast, but it's not that accurate. Sometimes it's accurate enough, but Cycles is mega accurate. So if I switch that back over to Cycles, you'll see that all this fuzziness, if I had enough iterations here in my ray bounces in my scene, then this is going to look really handsome at one point. So that's the difference between Eevee and Cycles. Cycles takes longer, is more accurate. Eevee is more or less immediate. It's not that accurate, but very, very good improvement in Blender 2.8. So very exciting stuff there. Yes, actually, Mike, in the intro sequence, do you see the letters that are flying out, my logo that's flying out? That was done in Eevee, and that was done in literally 2 minutes. The whole animation was rendered in 2 minutes because Eevee is so fast that it could do that. And in that instance, I thought, hey, that's actually that's acceptable. So you don't have to render it in Cycles if you don't need that processing power and if you don't need that accuracy. So yeah, absolutely, very good point. You can use that. Exactly, animation's super awesome because you don't have to sit there 5 months and wait for your high quality animation to come out. You just render it in Eevee, and if it's good enough, it's good enough. Absolutely. So I'm so super happy that we have it. So for my final render of my exciting cube scene here, I'm going to go and use Cycles. So I'm going to keep Cycles switched on. There's one other thing here. It says device on the bottom here. It says device, and you can switch between the GPU if you have one or the CPU. So right now this is using the CPU. I think I'm going to go and switch that over to GPU, and that may just be a little bit faster, especially for the final render there. It is still very fast in regards to real-time performance, I must say. Very cool. So putting all that together, how do we actually get a picture out of Blender? Because right now we're just looking at a scene. How do we get a picture out of Blender so that we can share it with our friends, family, and total strangers? And also maybe make some adjustments on the light there. Let's go back to looking through our camera with the 0 button on your numpad. That's that. And then, as we've learned already, make sure this little tick box is ticked, lock camera to view, so that we can frame up our cube. I'm going to go and do something like that, maybe. There's only so many ways you can frame up a cube. I'd like to bring in some of the shadow here, something like that maybe. And maybe something of the horizon, something like that maybe. Yeah, that'll be cool. That'll be cool. So this is now framed up. We can untick that if this is our final framing. There, like that maybe. Like that. Let's do it. Let's do it like that. That's cool. So untick that little box here that says lock camera to view. And actually we can make that a little bit bigger and move that over here. There we go. Perfect. And now to render the final result, we can either use the menu that's up here under render. You can render an image or the animation. You can either use either of them, or you can press F12. That'll do the same thing. So I'm going to use the menu and just see what happens. If I click that, new viewport appears to open up, and it looks like my cube is rendered in huge dimensions here. That's kind of a good start. Where did the dimensions come from? And what can we do about the lighting? How can we make that scene look better? I mean, this is a picture, first of all, so that's, awesome. Good stuff. Mission accomplished, first of all. That is a picture. It's slightly too large to fit on my monitor. If we were happy with this, we can head over here and click on Image, Save As. And that'll save us a copy of the image, which is very cool. That's it, stream over. No, actually, we'll do a little bit more than that. So you can go and click this, close this window, and go back to Blender, because there's a few things that we can do about it. Aside from the lighting, which we'll tackle in a moment, I wanted to show you something, and I'll see if I can make it so that it doesn't get obstructed by my face here. Does that work? Yes, that works. Up here, where we selected the Cycles render engine, we have we've got this thing here, but we've also got under sampling, we can see two numbers here, one for the render and one for the viewport. And that's the number of ray bounces that the Cycles render engine undertakes to give us a result. So right now, if we look at this, then this scene here in the preview window will be rendered with 32 iterations or ray bounces. And that's why I'm still seeing a little bit of grain here if I'm looking closely. Do I have a center button as well? Yeah, look at that. Cool. So I can see a little bit of grain here. But if I look at the final render, that grain may not be there. And that's because I can set these values independently. So I can go and set my render ray traces higher than my preview ray traces. 32 is a great number to get this real-time performance. And it has finished doing that. There's at the bottom, you can see somewhere, I think it's at the bottom somewhere, you can see how many of these ray bounces Blender does in the preview viewport. But if we go and set this to something higher, like, I don't know, 512 now, just for the render, our preview isn't going to change. But if we head over and render our image again, it'll now go and render slightly slower. And that's because it'll now be less grainy as a result as well. There we go, no grain. I like it. I like it a lot. So now we could say once this is finished, we can go, at the top left here, you can see how long the computer reckons it's going to take. So it takes another 40 odd seconds here to complete that scene. And you can also see at the top here how many tiles it's rendered and how many samples it is taken for that. So sometimes a tile, like one of those little buckets here, is rendered in more than one pass. And it'll also be denoised if you switch the denoiser on. That's another thing. You can do that in Blender too. If you ever want to abort the render process and the scene is taking like 4 hours to go and you think, yes, I really don't have time for that, click escape and then the render will stop. I believe you can also just close the window and then that'll also do the same thing. I might just put this back to maybe 256 here. Maybe that's a good starting point for the final render. And I'm going to have a look at the lighting and how we can change that. Yes, Patrick, it is like that. There is one better way that you can do it. You can use the samples in the viewport and crank them up. You can actually turn them down to 0 if you wanted to do that. So if you do that, then I've not actually tried that in the new version of Blender, but if you set them to 0 in the viewport, there is a way, look at that here at the very top, you can see the ray bounces that my machine is doing now. So he's now, this is, I guess, a really large number. I don't even know what that is. That is like 16.7 million bounces. It's probably the highest number you can put in there. And you can see how this number here is counting up. And that is now that is reflective of what the result looks like in your viewport. So there is a tip that I've learned, I think from Oliver Billiard, I believe. He said that if you set this to 0, then you can basically watch this number reach a value at which you're happy with the results. So as soon as I move this a little bit, then the value starts at 0 again. And I'll just press your camera again. And if you watch this, and as soon as you see no grain anymore, you can have a look at that number and give that an approximation of your scene. So I can still see a little bit of grain here, still a little bit of grain there, but it's getting less and less. So I guess there'll be the point at which you're happy with your scene. And at that point, you can just make a note of that number and say, hey, awesome, that's my ray count for the final scene. So you don't have to put it to 5,000 and see what happens and then go, well, maybe I'll make it slightly lower or make it slightly higher. You can literally watch this in real time and say, that's the number I was looking for. So that's an interesting one. It is, isn't it? So very cool. That's what happens when you set that to 0. It also means your computer will continuously render in the background. So if you want to conserve some power, just set it to one number or to a number that you know works for real-time preview, and then leave it there. So now kind of the computer kind of calms down now. I can totally do that, Netcheck, no problem at all. If you tell me, you have it, perfect. Julia's already done it. Julia was quicker, perfect. So let's have a look at the lighting now, because this doesn't look very interesting. And lighting is one of those things. I'm tempted to actually make a series about lighting, much like once I've finished the DAZ Studio lighting part of the series, maybe just apply the same principles to Blender. I think that would be a wonderful idea, because lighting is something that we can, we just need to know more about. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here, and so that we can see both our object and our light and our camera here. So we're not going to, we're just going to look at this view and select our light source here. And let's have a look where that is set. So without making any significant changes here, we've already learned how to move objects in the viewport. So we can just move the light around and see what that effect has. So let's try G followed by Z, and then just move the light down. I can see what happens to the shadow there. Perhaps I'm going to actually go and move this slightly further over here so that we can see, and then press N, that takes that panel away there. Gets us less decluttered here. So G followed by Z, and then I can bring the light down. This would be something, if we don't want to see that grainy fuzz there all the time, I can go and switch that over back to the Eevee render engine, and then those changes will be immediate. Why don't we do that? Click Escape to bring the object back to where it was and change my render engine back to Eevee. Now I'll hit G followed by Z and just bring that light down, and we can see the effect that has. It looks like that circle of light starting to get smaller here, and if I drop the light below our ground plane, it just disappears and doesn't illuminate anything anymore. But if it's just above the ground, then I can see what the effect is here. It's a point light, by the way, if you hadn't guessed. It's a point light, so it doesn't have rotation. It shines in all directions at whichever value is currently set that creates that. So that's what moving up and down does. I can also go and go and move that down a little bit like here. And then I'm going to go press G, Shift Z, and that'll now lock it in its height. And now I can go and move it around the cube. So it's not going to go further up or down, but I can go and see the effect it has on my cube's shadow there. Perhaps I want to have something slightly dramatic. Don't know, something like that. Or just right above. there's only so much you can do with a point light. For example, I can't rotate it. But Blender has a really cool function in regards to lights. You can, as opposed to DAZ Studio, in which you have to create a new light and then discard the old light. If I'm not happy with the look of this object, I can change the properties of this object. So I can turn a point light, which is what this is, into a distant light, or I can turn it into a spotlight. And that's very cool, or a hemispheric light. Very cool. Let's see how we can do that. So with the object selected, there is this little light symbol on the right here. Is that it? Yes, it's just about here. That's it. So let's click that. And perhaps I'm going to go move that down and do that. Aha, perfect. A setup for every eventuality. I like it. So right now I can see this is a point light, but I can also now change that into a sunlight or a spotlight or an area light. So very flexible, this setup here. And underneath it, I can set the color of the light and how hot it is, how much, what the wattage of the light is. So very cool. And then I can do all kinds of other stuff with it. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go and briefly go into how you can change the properties here. So if I go and change this to a sunlight now, it looks like this is bright, man. I really need some sunglasses here. So if I wanted to use a sunlight instead, I probably have to take the strength down to make that palatable here. So try something like 200. That's still too hot. Let's try 10. Yeah, okay, so it's kind of getting there. Maybe this is all, whoops, maybe this is all just a little bit too strong for my liking. Perhaps sun is not what I need. The values are retained, by the way. So now that I've made this much lower in strength, if I go back to point light, I can also see that my point light is almost no longer existent here. So that's kind of interesting. I could turn this into a spotlight. And spotlight is kind of fascinating. I always liked spotlights because they have these dramatic light circular effects here. So perhaps spotlight is something that I'd like to use. The final one is area. That's a bit like a mesh light in that we set up. It's like basically a plane that can have a certain shape and that emits the light. And the larger the plane is, the softer the shadows are. And the smaller the plane is, the harsher the shadows are. And then you can also set the actual shape of that area. So square, rectangle, disc, or ellipse. I think I'm not going to use an area light. I'm going to use a spotlight today because I really like the effect it can create there. So much like we would perhaps light a model with that light selected, I'm just going to bring that over kind of further over here. So that's, once again, that's G, Shift Z, because the height is kind of nice. And perhaps I'm going to do this and just now tumble the light around just a little bit to the left. So that would be R, Z, and then just move the mouse until we find the right spot. Something like that, perhaps. I like it. Oh yeah, we didn't look through the camera. Maybe do that again. Let's look through the camera. It's interesting, but it's just to get the effect of the shadow here. Maybe we'll just go and grab the light and move it over there. So G, Shift Z, and move it here, and then R, Z, and then just go, whoops, turn that light cone over here somewhat. We can also rotate the light a little bit further up. So that would be, what is that, Y, I guess, RY. Let's try that. Yeah, there we go. That's cool. That's a nice effect, perhaps. It makes our scene look very interesting. I'll move the camera position a little bit to make sure I get all the circly bits here. So once again, with the N key, you bring out that panel. Make sure you lock that camera in here. Shift, middle mouse button, move that over here. Something like that, maybe. Yeah, so now the cube is the star of the show. I like it. See See, exactly. Cube looks, like a superstar now. Let's see what he looks like in Eevee, of course. Sorry, in Cycles, of course. We can, I think, if we leave this in place and we head over to render image, then it'll render the same thing again, but in Eevee, and that in 1920 by 1080. So there we go. That's the full scene in Eevee. Very cool. But if we wanted to do this in Cycles again, let's head over to that little camera icon again, this here, and change the render engine back to Cycles. Very important. And here is everything in Cycles. Perfect. So let's see what that looks like. Render image. IES, I'm not sure, what is that, Mike? Yeah, I don't actually know what IES light is, guys. Sorry. So, poor cube. Good stuff. Very cool. There's tons of other things we could do. One thing I'd like to just play with and see if I can make that work is to make the shadows softer. See if we can get that going. That, I guess, would be something we can do in the Light tab. And I guess it may have something to do with the size of the spotlight. So currently it's 0.1 meters. So I guess we make that larger, turn it maybe into, yeah, there we go. That's exactly how it's done. If we turn that into a 2-meter light cube, then we can see that the shadows are getting a lot softer here. Very cool. Let's render that. That was easy, but it follows the same pattern. Larger light sources create softer shadows. Sometimes they also subtract from the amount of light that is emitted. So I'm glad to see that that's not happening here. So I still see the same intensity of the light, but it's just much softer. So we see the effect still, but it's much softer, much softer shadows here. Whoops, there we go. There, very nice. Cool. There's all kinds of other things we could do. We could do depth of field and all that, but I guess we're not going to do that. Maybe we will do that. I don't know yet. One thing I wanted to bring to your attention, if I close this down again, is of course, where does this aspect ratio come from? That's another thing. We've made a picture appear that comes out of Blender. That's awesome. We can share it with our mom, and I can say, hey mom, I've made a picture of a cube, and maybe the shadows are a little bit too soft now, so I'm going to make it maybe 0.5 meters so that we can still see some softness here. Maybe one meter. 1 meter is what we're going to do. And hi mom, by the way, it's my mom's birthday, by the way, today. Absolutely cool. My mom's birthday. Very exciting. She's celebrating in Bremen. Maybe she's watching. If you are watching, I hope you enjoyed that Indian meal. Very cool. Where does that aspect ratio come from? And that is something that in DAZ Studio and all the other things, we would have to go and enter the render settings somehow and then define an aspect ratio. And in Blender, it's very similar. It has to do with the camera settings here. And that is here on that little printer icon, context output. And we can, first of all, we can see the resolution here, 1920 by 1080. And we also have something down here, which is the percentage slider. And that's really cool if you have a resolution in mind that you want to do, like in my case, maybe I want to render a full HD scene like this, but for preview purposes, I want to render the full thing every once in a while, but not in full resolution. I'd maybe like something that's half the size or a quarter of the size. Then you can do that here. You can just change 100% to something like 50%. And that means it'll be half of whatever your X and Y resolution is. That's very cool. So now if we were to go and render the same thing again, then I'm not going to get that 1920 by 1080 image. I'm going to get half that, which is, I don't know, 1000 by 400, whatever, I guess. My maths isn't very good, but Anyway, you can do that. So that's what that percentage slider is for here. But this is also, that kind of also gives you the aspect ratio if you wanted to have a square image, and I wanted something like 1000 by 1000. If you set that, you can see that the dimmed out area here in your camera view. So it doesn't happen when you look at it like this in your regular perspective view. If you press the 0 on the numpad, you look through the camera. This is what your camera is going to look like now. And that's how you set that aspect ratio. Once again, 100% is going to give you this exact resolution that you type in here. But anything smaller than that will just, you know, reduce that resolution down. So that's how you can make portrait renders, like say this one is I don't know, 1200, and then Y is something like 2400. Well, it's maybe two portrait, but you know, something like 2000 or 200, doesn't matter, by 300. That's more like a portrait image. So that's where that's set. You also have these options for animation, start and finish here, which frames you'd like to render and at what frame rate if you're doing animations. But you know, that's kind of, maybe that's getting a little bit too far into the future here. Essentially, that's how you get a picture out of Blender. I'm gonna go and put that back to 1920 by 1080. There. And just perhaps one last thing I want to do before we end this, and that is if I go and render my image here, then one thing that annoys me personally a little bit is the fact that I get to see the horizon here. And the horizon is just the end of the plane, really. That's what I'm seeing, and that is fairly sharp and fairly harsh. And there, on one hand, I could just frame it out, but to make it look nice and easy, and that's another feature I wanted to show you that Blender has, very, very nicely implemented, is depth of field. And that is set on the camera object. And in DAZ Studio and in many other applications, we can literally set the focal length and the f-stop. But in Blender, we can literally select an object from the scene hierarchy at which we want the focal length to be, like with an eyedropper tool. That's just so cool. I love the way that they've implemented that. It's been in Blender for a while too, but I'm getting excited when I see good features, you know, so very, very cool. In fact, let's make that here maybe 66% of that. And I'll go, and for this, I guess I'm going to select my camera object. I also just want to make sure I'm not ruining the shot here. No, cool, perfect. With my camera object selected, I believe it's somewhere under here. I think there's two ways I need to switch it on. I think first of all, I need to switch it on. For that, I need to have a look around because I don't quite remember where that is. Was it under film? No. Motion blur, perhaps? No. Performance color management? I don't remember. It was here. Post-processing? No, that wasn't it. Metadata? No, that's not it. Passes. Remember, there were two ways that I had to, first of all, switch on the fact that we want to use depth of field, and then we also need to tell our camera where the depth of field point is. Ambient occlusion, look at that, viewport, settings. I like that you all wish my mom a happy birthday. That is very, very cool. She deserves it. Oh, that's the camera. There we are. Camera, that's a good idea. Oh, it's behind me. Oh, yeah, good point. Sorry, I thought I had switched to this. Thanks. Depth of field, there it is. It's on the camera tab. So depth of field, that's where we switch it on. And so the distance here is either numeric or it's here under focus object. So that's kind of cool. That's what I meant. So if I click that now, I can either pick an object from my scene hierarchy, or I believe I can just go into the scene and pick it. I believe, is that how it works? Here with the eyedropper tool here, I can pick that and then go literally hover over any of my objects in the scene. So I only have a cube and a plane here, but if I had like hundreds, I could literally just eyedrop on this and say that's where I'd like my my focal point to be. So cube, And then this thing grays out, the distance thing grays out. And then at the bottom here, we can see things like f-stop and how many blades it has and all that. So very cool. I'm not sure if that's enough, actually. Let's see if I make that really small. Yeah, okay, cool. It is enough. It is enough. I thought I had to switch something else on. So really to blur that horizon here, perhaps I'm going to try something like 1.2 and see what happens if I render that scene. See if it's done anything. Yeah, it has, but it's not that pronounced. I can see something. I can see the horizon is just a little bit softer. Didn't do much, but that's why you play around with depth of field, basically, is what I'm saying. So because it's I really like depth of field, and yeah, how about 1.0? Let's try 1.0 just out of curiosity, see what that looks like. Favorite of the food photographers. Yeah, it's getting softer, but there comes a point where even the cube itself is soft. I think Stanley Kubrick once made a movie with special lenses from NASA or whatever. They were 0.7 or something. So 1 to 0.7. So something that isn't really possible in reality, but he made it happen. So there we go. Playing bigger is a possibility. Yeah, we could do that. Look at that. Now that I've got it to 0.4, I can see that the effect is more pronounced here. So that's like very, very soft at the back. Playing out of focus is an idea, or then the other really simple solution is indeed to go and add a texture to it and just fuzz the texture out at the end. That's possible too. Also possible, yes. Could make it, could curve it up. Then you don't have a horizon. That's true. There we go. I think that is all I have for you today. A little getting started guide into Blender. There's of course so much more we can talk about and we could do, and but essentially that is how you get a picture out of Blender. So that is essentially how I made my little desk scene here the other day. You probably saw that. Maybe I can bring that back. And that was with all these Chocofer assets here. That's the one, my desk. I don't think I want to save that. There, this is it, exactly. This is how I made that scene. So we didn't have a horizon in my scene. Very, very simple. But yes, so it's a matter of adding the objects into your scene and then positioning them correctly, and then eventually just hitting render and making sure the framing is correct, and then making sure the aspect ratio is correct, make sure the lighting is correct, or when I say correct, is at a point at which you're happy with it, and then you press a button and it goes render, and then that's basically it. And that's exactly right, Mike. Practice does make perfect. So even though Blender is a kind of a complex and intimidating program, I do encourage you to keep going, keep sticking with it. This is a perfect opportunity to delve right into the features, especially if you haven't quite grasped the old interface, or that looked suspect and all that. There's just so much you can do, and don't let what people describe as a steep learning curve get in the way of having fun with Blender. I think for me, this is what this is all about. Blender is such a cool tool to have so much fun with. It is, it's just awesome to play with and explore its possibilities. And be assured, you'll never, in the near future, outgrow Blender. I've never found that Blender brings me to any limitations. There's always a solution. Even if you've explored every single Blender feature and you think, I long for something more. Where's the landscape generator? Or where's this tool? Where's that tool? It's available as a plugin. Someone's made it. And that's thankfully also thanks to the open nature of the program. So yes, that is really all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you can join me tomorrow. I have a special surprise on Subnautica Saturday. Maybe we're even going to find copper. Who knows? I have no idea. But that is tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Special surprise. Join me for that. I will see you later. Bye-bye.